from theCUBE studios in Palo Alto and Boston, bringing you data-driven insights from theCUBE and ETR. This is Breaking Analysis with Dave Vellante.
Literally days after we published our first AI Factories revenue outlook, Sam Altman and Satya Nadella introduced new data on the BG2 pod. These specific data points have given us an opportunity to revisit our figures and do so in the context of economist Erik Brynjolfsson's productivity J-curve. The productivity J-curve explains why new general purpose technologies like electricity, the steam engine, computing, and of course AI, often experience limited productivity growth at first because organizations have to learn, adapt, and reorganize in order to realize the benefits. But over time, these innovations tend to outperform expectations. In this breaking analysis, David Floyer, Jackie McGuire, Scott Hebner, Christophe, Bertrand, and I analyze this new data and debate the shape of the AI Factories economic curve. We'll briefly introduce the productivity J-curve. We'll share snippets from the Sam and Satya statements that in many ways address the productivity paradox that exists today in AI. We'll then revisit our AI Factories forecast and assumptions, talk about some of the headwinds the industry must overcome to reach our projections, and then close with a vision of the future of AI and service as software. Hello all, welcome, and thanks a lot for making some time today. Really appreciate it. Okay.
Hello and happy Friday.
Happy Friday. We made it.
It's been a long week. Yeah. The market's been crazy. The news has been crazy. So.
Yeah, and it's crazy right now. It's like up and down and down. All right, let's start with this idea of this productivity J-curve, which is actually, Jackie, to your point, why the market is a little bit crazy today. So the idea here is that in the early phases of general purpose technologies, ironically, when they wrote this paper in 2020, they used the term GPT, found that kind of curious. But anyway, in the early phases, adoption is messy, it's choppy, and things are confusing. And we've seen this before in other ways. And productivity is hard to find. And we're seeing that in the MIT study, the ETR data that we've shared around, MIT was single digits, we're getting, productivity hits. ETR data was 11 to 12%. But generally the sentiment in the market says that ROI has been challenging to achieve with AI. And the idea is it takes a long time for companies to adapt to these new innovations, which is, again, as Jackie's pointing out, why we're seeing things in the market down. Things like agentic AI, we've said, is going to take the better part of a decade to gestate. And Brynjolfsson's curve actually shows a dip, a negative in productivity. I don't think we're seeing that at the macroeconomic level, but you could argue that if you simply isolate on the AI CapEx spend as the input and revenue as the output, then productivity is most definitely negative. So this is what I call this productivity paradox around AI that we're seeing today has folks concerned. Of course, stock market's careening downward these past few days on fears of an AI bubble. But this weekend, Brad Gerstner hosted Sam Altman and Satya Nadella on his podcast. So let's listen to some of their statements, and then we're going to come back and discuss. Please play the clips.
How can a company with 13 billion in revenues make 1.4 trillion of spend commitments? And you've heard the criticism,
First
Sam.
of all, we're doing well more revenue than that. Second of all, Brad, if you want to sell your shares, I'll find you a buyer. I just, enough. People are, I think there's a lot of people who would love to buy OpenAI shares. I don't think you would.
Including myself. Including myself.
There is not been a single business plan that I've seen from OpenAI that they're put in and not beaten it.
If you guys were, are doing in excess of $100 billion of revenue in 28 or 29, that you at least would be in position. What?
How about 27?
Yeah, 27, even better.
Okay, so Jackie, you heard Sam saying we're doing well more than 13 billion, and Satya talking about how well they execute. You made a statement in our prep call about the enthusiasm of these executives. What did you mean?
Well, I said I think their tone tells you a lot about the message, and enthusiasm is a word for it. To me, Sam actually sounded a little bit defensive. In the we're doing well more than 13 billion. And then, I don't know. And it just came around. it sounded to me like on one side that we're doing way better than that, and on the other side, like, I'm telling you, guy, this is a sure bet. Like, like take the Dodgers in the World Series. I've never seen him not lose a game. Like it just like I don't know. I think there was, we didn't actually talk about this, but there was an article last week in Wired that was called like AI is the bubble to burst them all. And it was talking about, what the different things are that characterize a bubble, how people talk about it as one of them. And yeah, I don't know. I just found the tone to be very like uh
Defensive.
more defensive than I would expect for somebody that feels really, really secure in the amount of revenue they're doing.
Excellent. Okay, good. I'm glad you clarified that. I don't know, you guys, are we in a bubble? Who thinks we're in a bubble?
I don't.
I don't. I think it's still forming. Whether it pops or not is to be determined. I think it's less likely than .com.
So
Yeah,
the interesting analog that Wired magazine had was radio, because there was a massive bubble in radio in the 1920s. So RCA started broadcasting in 1919, and there was just this massive investment without a real clear path to monetization that made sense. And ad revenue wasn't really it at the time because people didn't have radios. So yeah. So anyway, it's an interesting read if you get a chance.
And Andrew Ross Sorkin's book, 1929, talks about RCA as the OpenAI of that day. So interesting. All right, David, your original projections, like Gerstner's, had OpenAI, hovering around 13 billion today and then crossing 100 billion. You had it like at 28 or 29. And Sam is putting a stake in the ground saying they're doing, as Jackie said, well more was the exact statement than 13 billion. And he's shooting for 100 billion by 27. Satya talked about the execution machine. What do you make of this?
He's saying that this year he has a run rate of 20 billion, and the projection forward that he's stating seem reasonable to me. There is enormous value. He is obviously won, 800 million users. An awful lot of those are in companies. And in addition, he has the rate of production of new APIs and new software is fantastic. So I am in great admiration of the job that he's done.
Yeah, you and Satya, right? All right, let's revisit our data center forecast from this past April that David, you just updated. So to build data centers, you need land, you need power, you need water, and then you got to build out the infrastructure, the power distribution, the chillers, the primary and secondary fluid networks, and of course, compute storage and networking. So this is all that data center spend, which hits $1 trillion by 2031 with a very strong decade plus CAGR of 17%. So that's up from your last forecast, David. And of course, the AI portion, you've accelerated quite dramatically. That's the darker brown, shows a CAGR of 39%, which is massive. So in the past, David, we've used this to quantify the transition to accelerated computing, or what you call extreme parallel processing. Here, your updated forecast pulls forward the spending based on the recent earnings prints, I presume. What's behind your thinking?
Yeah, we got some good input into the whole number of different agreements that OpenAI have made with a whole number of, it really has cornered a large percentage of the total production of chips, etc. So he's made sure that he's got the equipment and the GPUs in place to be able to provide the services that he's foreseeing. And that was good information. And on top of that, we're seeing obviously Google spending more. If you take those combination of data, I've increased the expected revenue, the expected spend on AI AI factories.
Yeah, the AI portion of this forecast, the dark brown is what you're talking
The
about.
dark brown. The light brown is traditional data centers. And my view is that the AI factories are going to provide a huge amount of that computing. That's not to say that enterprises aren't going to pay for that. Probably about 60% of the payment, at least, will come from enterprises. So they'll be paying back those investments.
You know, I want to revisit the bubble comment. I'll share with you something I've talked about a little bit in the CUBE pod, but I heard one of the Wall Street analysts on TV recently say, when they were asking him about the bubble, it was Stacy Ragson, sharp analyst. And he was saying, look, it's not like 1999, 2000 when we were putting in all this dark fiber and it just sat there. It was this sort of empty dark fiber, and then eventually it filled up and we know what happened. He said today, these GPUs, they're all lit up. They're not underutilized. But I will tell you that and I've talked to a handful of them, enterprises that actually have 1,000 or more GPUs installed, they actually are underutilized. They're not in the neo clouds, probably not in the clouds, but organizations, they've kind of lost some of their muscle memory as to not only how to run data centers, they've skinnied that down, but they're not expert at running parallel computing. And their utilization on these GPUs is well under 30%. And so that's sort of one factor. The second factor is these GPUs depreciate at very rapid rates. A couple of years, they're worthless. Whereas the dark fiber sat there empty, okay, fine, but it wasn't a depreciating asset. Now they were able to use it 5-10 years later. So those are some interesting dynamics that not a lot of people are talking about. Do you guys have any thoughts on it? I'm not saying it's a bubble, but it's something to watch in terms of, my point being, if the enterprises aren't able to take advantage of those investments and don't get an ROI, I think they're going to get an ROI elsewhere, I guess is my point. And I think that's something we're going to talk about. But do you guys have any thoughts on that, Jackie? I know you know a lot about data centers. Any thoughts on that?
One of the other things that may happen is, I've been talking to, I've done a couple interviews with Dell in the last few months, and you talked to Michael Dell at Dell Tech World, and one of the other things that's going to happen is there was this whole wave of enterprise PCs that were purchased during COVID that all need to be refreshed, and they're going to be refreshed with endpoints that have significantly more computing power, that have chips built into the motherboards for doing some of this compute.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think that there is a chance here that once we find a better balance, because cloud computing was never meant to be all in, and there are cloud native businesses, and that does make sense for a segment of businesses, but it was more the economics of cloud and how easy it was to buy things and not having to go through a procurement process for hardware. You can just spin it up in the cloud. And so I think we will see a return back to hybrid that may very well leave some of these legacy data centers. And to your point, this is not only just an e-waste nightmare. Like, think about how many racks are in these data centers of crap that if we're actually saying that's going to be replaced every 12 to 18 months, that is like literally that means that we're going to start at one end of a data center and just start replacing racks. And when we get to the end of the data center, we just go back to the beginning and start again, because it's not like you can swap these things all out at once. You have to have people in there doing it, there's just a whole thing that's going to happen here that I think is like, I don't know if we're being realistic about what this is going to mean in terms of labor and things like that. But yes, I think a combination between hybrid computing and what it's actually going to take to, in production, maintain these things, if they truly do have a 12 to 18 month shelf life, that's a pretty heavy lift.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Jackie, you're 100% right. But keying on your hybrid comment is that each company is going to have a different configuration of how to do that, right? It is not going to be a one size fits all. So there's going to be all different kinds of approaches to this. And that's where the choice and flexibility becomes really, really important to be able to configure as makes sense for you. And there'll be different timeframes for upgrading, and you can tap into more public capabilities in the meantime. And it's always going to be a mix, you know?
I would like to add one more thing, which is we've talked about data centers. So can we talk about data? It's not just compute. It's going to be about the amount of data you have to manage, and the metadata that's created with it as you track whatever your agents will be doing. So I think we're going to see a fundamental shift in a couple of areas. Number one, I think a lot of the costs here, David, are going to be storage based, not just GPUs. And secondly, I think technologies, surprisingly, that have been around for a long time, since mainframe, like tape, will probably come back with a revenge. I also see storage vendors, and that's already happening, really changing their story, their tune, and their technology with, I think, some interesting arms races going on right now in terms of who's going to be closest to the compute or better for AI. And it's going to matter, especially with those 12 to 18 months type of, never stop to paint the Golden Gate Bridge,
exactly.
type of thing, right? So, but data is going to be key, and I think we have a big data issue, which is also probably why you cannot get to AI at scale, because right now people don't even have a good handle on their data to begin with.
All right, thank you for that, guys. Let's take a look at and debate the updated revenue forecast, including our view of OpenAI. So let's zero in on OpenAI, because David, that's the big change that you've made here. Sam said we're doing well more than 13 billion, which was the consensus number, and you have 15 billion this year. So what's your thinking there? That's not really well more. And then talk about your scenarios for the out years.
Well, the 20 billion that he said was annualized run rate. So assuming that that's somewhere near when he spoke.
Yep, okay, fair enough. Yep, that makes sense.
That.
But what about the out years? Actually, Ken, bring that back up. You're showing some pretty substantial growth here for OpenAI, which is kind of aligns with, I think, what Sam was indicating, crossing 100 billion run rate in 2027.
Yep, 100 billion, and again, I assumed he was talking about run rate, so
Yep.
it's a little bit lower than that. Just going on from that, what is happening at the moment, obviously, is it's mainly consumer and prosumer usage, but over that time, OpenAI are very rapidly producing new software and new APIs, and those are the APIs that will help link into the data on site. Those are the APIs that will be a top-down, bottom-up view, allowing much more integrated systems between the users and the factories.
Now you have Google Anthropic. Was that just to be more economical in the space? Because Google's
Not at all.
Anthropic has
No.
a very tight relationship with AWS as well. AWS is invested in them. Why Google Anthropic?
Well, my view is that Google will have a tremendous difficulty in trying to get over everything defending their current revenue. So Anthropic use TPUs, mainly use TPUs. They have a lot. They couldn't be sold somewhere else without Google being able to stop them getting TPUs. So I think that they will join forces, and Anthropic will become the new arm of Google, which can be independent.
Oh, interesting. Okay, and you got China, obviously formidable here. Some others. I always say others.
China
could be big.
I've increased China because of the non-provision of U.S. technology.
Okay, so you got OpenAI being a dominant force. Scott, you've got some concerns about that. Elon Musk calls them closed AI. What are your thoughts on this sort of vertically integrated approach to AI?
Yeah, what I found interesting about the BG2 podcast was what they spent some 70 minutes mapping out the future of AI factories and how they'll benefit. But if you go back through it, zero mentions of open standards or protocols or platforms, zero mentions of ecosystem building, zero mentions of integrating the so-called intelligence economy. There's a lot of proprietary discussion, the proprietary token factories, the proprietary agent runtimes, even the data graphs are proprietary for Microsoft, right? So my concern would be without an open approach, they risk creating AI factories that will not foster a multi-company, multi-factory B2B integration model, which is what I think most people mean when they talk about the intelligence economy, right? Where intelligence helps businesses partner within a business ecosystem to drive new dimensions of growth for all and new levels of service to their customers. So if you think about it, without open standards, B2B integration via the AI factories will collapse into a proprietary patchwork of probably chaos. And it very much sounds like deja vu all over again. And I think there's a lot from history to learn from. And, you go all the way back to electricity, Edison versus Westinghouse. Cities were wired in chaos, different plugs, different voltages, different frequencies. It basically froze innovation and adoption. Come IEEE standards, one plug, one voltage, led to appliance factories, right? Where you can plug in all these different appliances, revitalize the economy. And basically what you had is an electricity ecosystem where everyone can plug into it. You can tell the same story about the internet and the browser wars that were basically going to fracture it. And, the open standards came and have made it into, you can think of as a new commerce factory where people can integrate openly. I even think back, Dave, to my old employer, the mothership, IBM. And if you think back some 3 decades ago, maybe 2.5 decades ago, the whole PC, personal computing era, they were the elephant in the room. Big, dominant, arrogant. No one's going to get fired for buying IBM. No one will ever have anything other than an IBM PC. That's all that anyone's ever going to want. Just like the mainframe, they went into microchannel architecture, 100% proprietary, right? And what happened? IBM's share of the PC market went from like 80% to 8%. Huge fall off in just 5 years. The elephant almost died and they spent billions trying to recover. So, OpenAI, Microsoft, AI factories, I think they have a choice. Option A is stay closed, dominant, right? And then spend billions retrofitting down the road, sort of IBM 2.0, or, lead the open grid, right? And let any model plug into any factory, allow businesses to tap into their proprietary data and work together. And if they don't do it, with $4 trillion of US CapEx pouring in, which is massive, it's like 10 times the Manhattan Project, there will be others that can unseat them down the road. So my message, I think, is the open intelligence grid will be the accelerant to their growth, and that's how they go from 13 to 100 billion. A closed approach, I don't think will get them there.
Well, this is an age-old argument, isn't it? Go ahead, Jackie.
I was going to say, isn't venture, we would have to completely rethink venture capital though, because right now venture capital is all based on defensible IP and winner take all with defensible IP and suing the pants off of anybody who comes anywhere close to building something. And I mean and we were talking about this before, like there are a lot of paradigms for revenue and investment and growth and things like that we really have to rethink, from cloud computing to venture capital to the way we do things. Because I agree, Scott, I think that we will not get where we need to go without open source framework. One, AI, the biggest thing that they're missing right now, in addition to unlimited clean power and water, is trust. And to build trust, you have to have some level of transparency and openness and accountability. And if we're going to give everything to AI agents and there's nobody to fire anymore, there has to be some level of transparency, right? So no, I love what you're saying. I think that most venture capital and private equity is built on the polar opposite, unfortunately.
Well, and the history of the tech industry suggests that, de facto standards, starting with the IBM 360, I would argue, Scott, that the PC was essentially a case of IBM handing its monopoly closed, vertically integrated system to Intel and Microsoft, which created this virtual integration and proprietary, even though it was considered open. It was because it was open because it was, look who made all the money there. It was really Intel and Microsoft. But that did become an industry standard. I would say AWS is another example. NVIDIA itself is an example. The flip side of that is the LAMP stack built, the internet, and TCP/IP is clearly a standard. So there are, and open source, Linux, there are places where these open standards do accelerate growth and innovation. I think that is kind of an interest. iPhone is another example. iPhone, Android. So both models can work. The big question I have, because you saw OpenAI announce an open weight model, but it's basically a N-1, a less functional model. And you got China, N-2, right? You got China doing all these open source models, that are coming out months after OpenAI or whichever research lab announces something. So that is something to watch for sure. Other comments?
Let me just make two comments on that. One is, I think the point about IBM was they were so dominant that it was inconceivable that they would not continue to be the leader, and look what happened. So
but that's hubris, right? That's not open versus closed. That's just bad business.
Right, but it was the open standards part that really killed them in the end, because they did not go open when the others did, and Windows was able to run across any PC, where you could not do that with the IBM because it was a micro-channel proprietary architecture. But I think the bigger point here is what customers want, what enterprises. If the AI factory is there to feed you in a client server model, a vertically integrated stack might be okay. If it's there to help you integrate and do business with other factories and other companies that are feeding through some other factory, it won't work. It'll be too much expense to do all these proprietary adapters and all that. So, and I think you just have enterprises that just went through, and I know this firsthand because I lived it at IBM. The biggest problem they had was all these cloud environments, these hyperscalers, they were all proprietary and they were fragmenting everything and nothing would work together. And I don't think they were going to be as willing to repeat that mistake again with the AI factories.
So actually, this is a very interesting point you're making with the cloud analogy here. And also I heard trust from Jackie. And I think the biggest issue, go back to my earlier comment on data. If one thing has to be unified, whatever model ends up being used later in the factory model, you have to have unified data. You have to be able, as an enterprise, to be in control of all of your data so that it can be trusted and used by, again, I'm not going to pick a champion here, by whatever model, by whatever vendor coalition or whatever you want to call it. Now, this being said, interestingly enough, in the world of cloud, what we've seen is backup and recovery vendors, on top of becoming cyber resiliency vendors, are great at migrating data from cloud to data center back and forth at scale. And I think this is something we should not forget. There is a very interesting play for a number of vendors today who may come from boring backup into this new era that's going to require a lot of unification of data, a lot of cleanup of data, a lot of management, and again, a lot of movement on top of, and that's talking about existing data and production data, not even talking about the additional data that's going to be created by the factories themselves.
To your point, if the data is the bloodline of AI, right? And you're an enterprise and there are 5 AI factories that you can integrate with, and 4 of them happen to be open and 1 is closed. Are you going to do it twice? Or are you going to use one standard protocol to integrate with them, right? And imagine if they all go proprietary, then you run into the same problem you have with the cloud, or the same problem you had with the e-business.
I'd like to make a couple of points.
Yeah, go ahead, because we'll give you last word on this one, because it's your forecast on the line here.
Yes, that's right. First of all, de facto standards have come in almost in every area. Secondly, yes, there will be a need to create interfaces between the clouds that survive, the AI factories that survive. And I think they will, for the reasons that you said. But they will define those themselves. They won't be an outside, this is what you've got to do. It'll be because those two companies want to work together and find a way of doing it. So de facto standards have always for almost every new invention have been the first thing that happens. IBM 360, for example, and over time, then other standards can come in on top of those.
All right, we got to move on. Let's look at this in terms of productivity of that spend by assessing the cumulative CapEx input to build out the AI factories. So that's the CapEx boom that we're seeing now, and the cumulative revenue that's produced. So the orange line coincides with the data center AI factory build out forecast that we just showed earlier. And it indicates that by 2030, we'll have shelled out nearly 4 trillion in data center spend since the big uptick in AI build out, which occurred in 2024. This, by the way, aligns with NVIDIA's statements, which were in the $3 to $4 trillion range cumulatively by that time frame. The green line is the cumulative revenue that we just showed you from the previous chart. And you can see the early J-curve learning phase where there's quite a large gap between the spend out and the revenue in. The productivity is low or negative. And we're showing an 11-year break-even period with what is implied a massive net present value projecting skyward in the out years as operating leverage kicks in. I think this aligns with most optimists, AI optimists, although many people, when I tell them agentic's going to take the better part of a decade to play out, they say, no, it's here already. I think this chart underscores that it's not here. So first, David, give us your thinking here, and I'd like Christophe, Jackie, and Scott to comment on these headwinds that we've cited here. You can see we're citing big. First of all, the CapEx huge, so you got to catch up to the denominator. But we talked about earlier, Jackie, land, power, and water, skilled labor. We're going to talk about data quality, Christophe and Scott, governance, global regulations. But start us off here, David.
So, well, the three that I've identified as key are, Christophe was mentioning it, the quality of data. The quality of data on the internet is pretty poor. Quality data inside organizations is probably even worse. So there has to be a process by which the data is improved inside organizations, inside enterprises, and also the techniques of improving the data. So that will slow down. I like to think of things as velocity, value. The value is very high, but in this case, you've got a lot of inhibitors. The velocity can't be as high because of all of these barriers that have to be got. And the third barrier I believe is very, very important is that OpenAI and Google, Anthropic, and whoever else, they have to build the software. They are going to be the people that create a unified agentic system that will actually work. I don't think it can be top down from enterprises doing that. It's going to be from the research, from the factories, the AI factories, and coming up. So they will take time to build those, to test those, to get trust in those, and do all the things that are necessary to ensure that they can work properly. But that's going to take time. But after those things have happened, then you can foresee that there will be a tremendous improvement in terms of productivity, in terms of revenue, in terms of value that companies can give. A lot of those companies are going to be startups, so there'll be a lot of large companies that fail to take this route properly, but there will be overall a huge amount of value created.
All right, guys, so what do you think? You guys buy that?
Partially, I do, to the extent that I can see from my standpoint that the data piece, data quality, just the basic management right now is a mess. Data is all over the place. It's not and it's not necessarily compliant to begin with current regulations, and new regulations are kicking in, and there will be even more, which is going to create other potentially international political tensions, because if you want to do business with areas of the world that may have very restrictive type of regulations, you could end up in another sort of commercial war. So I think there are lots of things at play. The time frame seems about right, but I think there are lots of hurdles along the way that we're not quite seeing yet. This being said, maybe the path to success will not be this, massive deployment of AI everywhere, but more likely specific workflows and use cases that are maybe core to specific businesses, where those are not experiments, they're actual implementations, and that may accelerate things too to a certain extent, because again, not every process in the enterprise is where the value is going to be the most leveraged. So 10 years seems about right, but it could be shorter for some in some specific areas.
Well,
I hope so.
Part of the issue is there's so much CapEx going out. It's just going to take a long time to catch up for that. But so Jackie, you're deep into security, but you also happen to have real knowledge of data centers. And you shared this study with us on the pre-call. Can U.S. infrastructure keep up with the AI economy? So Jackie, before we go on to the labor question, I want you to discuss your concerns about energy, and then we'll sort of steel man that. And that's, we'll start there, Jackie, if you would.
Yeah, so for all of these different data centers, they need massive amounts of power and massive amounts of water, and they don't need massive amounts of power and water from one utility company. They need them from two, because you need redundancy. So this generally has historically meant they first started building data centers in places that were very cold and very dry so that they could use evaporative cooling, which was cheap. But now that we have these AI racks that run significantly hotter, we have to use liquid cooling and mechanical cooling. And so this has generally meant building data centers in places in, say, like the Midwest, places where you generally wouldn't choose to go live if you're making six figures at a tech company. And so a couple things are happening. One, we're seeing an increase in utility rates that's very localized to places where data centers move in. There are multiple heat maps that show that over the course of the 2 to 3 years after a data center is built, that the utility rates go up in that area, which makes sense. And then the other thing is, even if we could, in most of this, at the end of the day, there's a lot of generators being used. Those run on diesel. A lot of electricity in our grid comes from coal. So this is not clean energy. And yes, some of these companies are making massive investments in clean energy, but that takes time to come online. And then nuclear is something that people are looking to. And I've been very open about the fact that I have a lot of investments in nuclear companies, because I do think nuclear is one of the only ways we're going to achieve anywhere close to, well, a future of humanity for one, but for two, the energy capacity in megawatts that we need to deliver $3 trillion, $4 trillion in value. And so the problem there is that nuclear engineers aren't born overnight. Neither are diesel generator mechanics, neither are large-scale commercial chiller mechanics. And even if they existed, they don't necessarily want to go live in the places where data centers are. And so this survey that we were looking at showed that the
So let's, sorry to interrupt. Let's talk about one of those things. Let's bring that next slide up, because this really is key. It's one of those things that a lot of people are discussing, and that's who's going to build this stuff. So Jackie, this is data from the same study. Its source is Deloitte, and your point is not just anyone can build out these data centers. It takes really specialized skill. There's a shortage of labor there. You got hyperscalers are going to have to, pay up. Governments are fighting for talent. You got, we talked about regulations, but your thoughts on this, please continue.
Yeah, I mean, so if you look at this, there's a handful of things that I think this J curve, if we're going to buy full scale into the hype and say this is the most transformational technology that humanity has seen, that means a number of things. That means that the jobs that typically have kept lower middle class people in a house and fed, those go away. And so we need to find a way, one, to retrain a massive amount of people who are no longer going to have jobs because we've automated them away with agents. And then two, these types of jobs are skilled labor. And it's been a long time since in any meaningful way, the federal government has made large scale investments in skilled labor. And you're talking about everything from those mechanics to even all the way back to the factory floor, where the types of welding you have to do on these machines, this isn't normal welding. This is large scale commercial welding, which is actually a pretty specialized skill. So everything from building these machines to installing them, to servicing them, to like, we just don't have the people. And that is a whole flywheel that takes years. And if we want to get that done in the next couple of years to hit this 3, 4, $8 trillion mark, whatever number you're going to make up, that's like an all hands on deck thing. That's fundamentally changing it, probably starting at the middle and high school level, how we teach people. This means that we need to focus more on robotics. Like robotics is probably one of the only ways that we're going to be able to service data centers that are 7 football fields long each with 12 buildings on a campus. That's
Interesting
insane.
insights, really interesting insights. All right, we got to press on. Let's close by listening to a clip from Satya Nadella on the economics of software from that same video. Please play the clip.
So the new SaaS applications, as you rightfully said, are intelligent applications that are optimized for a set of evals and a set of outcomes that then know how to use the token factory's output most efficiently. Sometimes latency matters, sometimes performance matters. And knowing how to do that trade in a smart way is where the SaaS application value is. But overall, it is going to be true that there is a real marginal cost to software this time around. It was there in the cloud era too. When we were doing, CD-ROMs, there wasn't much of a marginal cost. With the cloud, there was, and this time around, it's a lot more. And so therefore, the business models have to adjust, and you have to do these optimizations for the agent factory and the token factory separately.
So the key to what Nadella was saying, whether or not you agree about the software, where the value is, and there's certainly some merit to that, is the comments on marginal cost. He's saying when we're shipping CD-ROMs, the marginal cost at volume went down to basically what it cost the CD-ROM itself, so near zero. With SaaS, software companies had to pay the cloud OpEx. Remember the $1 trillion paradox that was written by Martin Casado and Sarah Wong from Andreessen. So with AI, it's even worse, right? You need expensive GPUs that are, as we said, depreciating very quickly. So the gross margins are going to be lower, but potentially the volume is going to be much higher. And the other key point Satya makes aligns with George Gilbert's service as software scenario, where the technology model changes, the business model, the operation model, all those things are going to change. And then software-like marginal economics are going to benefit the buyers of AI, perhaps more so than the sellers, except for maybe a couple of sellers, and has got this winner takes most dynamic kicks in. Guys, I'd love for you to give us final thoughts, briefly, because I know we're up against the clock, but Jackie, Christophe, Scott, David, how do you see this?
I'll jump in on just thinking ahead here a little bit. A lot of the economics are based on the escalating costs of the infrastructure to run all these AI models that are just becoming more and more sophisticated. And the way they're becoming more and more sophisticated is through brute force, right? More and more parameters, more and more tokens, trillions, whatever comes after trillions. It requires an incredible amount of compute power to pull these things off. I think you're likely to see in the years ahead new methodologies and new ways to actually reduce the need for that power in the software. For example, if there are 200 parameters that influences a particular outcome, but you find out that only 80 of the 200 actually make a real impact, right? The rest are sort of intangible in terms of what they do. You can reduce the need for the compute power by almost half, right? By being smarter on your data and using some of the advanced technologies that are coming out. So that could be a mitigating factor as we go into the next 10 years, is not everything's going to be necessarily based on brute force, which requires this massive computing investment that's going on here.
Yeah, I think quadrillion. Anybody else want to chime in? It comes after trillions. I think anybody else want to chime in here?
Yeah, you mentioned robotics, Jackie, and I think that's exactly the point I was making around tape technology for massive storage of data at minimal cost, and unless it's needed immediately, zero power cost in consumption. So it sounds again like we already have some of the technologies available today to get some of this done.
I'd like to make an agreement that there will be a lot of distributed AI computing. Certainly the inputs that come in, for example, in the Apple ChatGPT, Apple clean up the inputs going to ChatGPT and reduce the overhead and time to get the responses. So a lot of systems will be providing input into systems from distribute in a distributed way. And secondly, there'll be a lot of distribution between the enterprises and the factories. But I would suggest that the most likely way that's going to happen is by the factories producing APIs, producing systems which you can just put in locally, which are going to provide that front end and work much, much better than an enterprise independently trying to work with the vendors, the factory vendors. So really, it's a different way of thinking about enterprise computing. You're going to reduce the amount you're going to have in-house. Data is very, very important. You need to manage that, etc. That's going to be a very high value. But computing, the knowledge that you're going to get is going to come from very large centers. And they themselves will improve and improve and improve. And the people with the greatest volume will improve fastest, which is why NVIDIA and OpenAI at the moment are good bets.
Okay, thank you guys. I'm sorry, we got to run. I really appreciate each of you joining us today. Jackie, great comments. Scott, Christophe, and David, thanks all. And David, thanks for rapidly updating your forecast. Check out siliconangle.com, thecuberesearch.com. Check out our podcast wherever you listen. We publish each week. And yeah, check out our friends at ETR, etr.ai. This is Dave Vellante for theCUBE Research Insights. Thanks for watching, everybody, and we'll see you next time on Breaking Analysis.